Before we unlock the archives on one of the most improbable intelligence victories of the 20th century, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and enable notifications. History is filled with secrets, and you won't want to miss what we uncover next. The year was 1979. The location was the quiet, leaf-strewn suburb of Falls Church, Virginia. It was a place of manicured lawns, station wagons with wood paneling, and the comforting, rhythmic predictability of American middle-class life. It was the kind of place where the most exciting event of the week was the delivery of the Sunday paper, or a particularly spirited debate at the local zoning board meeting. It was the last place anyone, least of all the Federal Bureau of Investigation, expected to find the endpoint of a decade-long manhunt. But espionage, as history often reminds us, does not always look like a film noir. It does not always involve silenced pistols and high-speed chases through the rainy streets of Berlin. Sometimes the greatest cracks in the Iron Curtain are caused not by a master spy, but by a bored actuary with a hobby. His name was Arthur Pence. He was 52 years old, a man of mild temperament and rigorous routine. Arthur worked for a mid-sized insurance firm in downtown Washington, D.C., processing risk assessments for commercial real estate. He was a man who found comfort in numbers because numbers, unlike people, followed rules. He lived alone in a small, split-level house on Elm Street, having never married. His neighbors considered him pleasant but dull, the kind of man who would wave politely while retrieving his mail, but never engage in a conversation that lasted longer than 30 seconds. Arthur's life was defined by its lack of excitement. He drove a beige Ford sedan. He wore beige cardigans. He ate a turkey sandwich on rye bread every day for lunch at exactly 12:15. But Arthur Pence had a secret, albeit a very innocent one. He had an unquenchable fascination with the gadgets and novelties found in the back pages of mechanics magazines and mail-order catalogs. In late August of 1979, Arthur sat at his kitchen table, circling an item in the back of a popular science magazine. It wasn't a telescope or a metal detector this time. It was an advertisement that promised professional espionage gear for the amateur sleuth. For the price of $19.95 plus shipping, one could purchase the Eagle Eye 110, a pocket-sized camera advertised as being small enough to fit in a cigarette pack, yet capable of taking crystal-clear surveillance photos. Arthur was not a spy. He was not paranoid. He simply enjoyed the mechanics of things. He liked the idea of owning a piece of technology that claimed to be special. He filled out the order form in his neat block-letter handwriting, wrote a check, and mailed the envelope the next morning. He expected a toy. He expected a piece of plastic junk that he would tinker with for an afternoon and then relegate to the junk drawer. He did not know that his purchase would trigger a chain of events that would eventually land on the desk of the Director of Central Intelligence. He did not know that by photographing the mundane world around him, he was about to capture the ghost that every counterintelligence agency in the West had been chasing for 12 years. The package arrived 3 weeks later, wrapped in brown paper and stamped with a return address from a warehouse in New Jersey. Arthur opened it with the precise care he applied to everything in his life, using a letter opener to slice the tape without tearing the cardboard. Inside was the camera. It was cheap. That was the first thing Arthur noticed. The body was made of a brittle black plastic that smelled faintly of chemicals. The lens, however, surprised him. It was heavier than the rest of the unit, glass rather than plastic, and it moved with a smooth, silent action when he twisted the focus ring. The kit included 3 rolls of high-speed black and white film, a small instruction manual written in broken English, and a developing kit that promised darkroom results in your own bathroom. Arthur spent that Saturday afternoon familiarizing himself with the device. The advertisement had been hyperbolic, of course. It wasn't professional gear, but it had a unique shutter mechanism. It was quiet, virtually silent, and because it was designed to look like a small transistor radio when the lens was retracted, it was incredibly discreet. He began his new hobby on Sunday. He didn't have any targets, so he photographed what was available. He took pictures of the squirrels fighting over acorns in his oak tree. He took pictures of the milkman delivering bottles to the house across the street. He took pictures of the cracks in the sidewalk. It was a harmless way to pass the time. Arthur enjoyed the technical challenge of estimating light and distance without a light meter. He turned his downstairs powder room into a makeshift darkroom, sealing the window with black construction paper and setting up the chemical trays on the vanity. The first few rolls were unremarkable. Blurry images of trees, overexposed shots of cars passing by. But Arthur was a man of persistence. He adjusted his technique. He learned to hold his breath when he pressed the shutter to minimize shake. He learned how to brace the camera against a fence post or a window frame. By October, Arthur Pence had become the unofficial, unwitting documentarian of Elm Street. He knew who walked their dogs at 6 a.m. and who didn't pick up after them. He knew which teenagers were sneaking cigarettes behind the community center. He captured the rhythm of the neighborhood in grainy, high-contrast black and white. And then a new neighbor moved into the house at the end of the cul-de-sac. The for sale sign at 442 Elm Street had been taken down in early September. The house, a colonial much larger than Arthur's, had been purchased by a man named Thomas Miller. Miller was charming. He was gregarious. He threw a block party 2 weeks after moving in, serving expensive steaks and imported beer. He told the neighbors he was a consultant for an international logistics firm, a job that explained his irregular hours and frequent travel. Arthur attended the block party. He wore his beige cardigan. He drank a ginger ale. He stood by the azalea bushes and watched Thomas Miller hold court. Miller was handsome in a rugged way, with graying temples and a smile that seemed to put everyone at ease. He remembered everyone's names. He laughed at their jokes. He seemed like the perfect addition to the neighborhood. Arthur had the camera in his pocket. He didn't take it out. It felt rude to photograph a man who was being so generous with his hospitality, but Arthur was an observer by nature, and something about Thomas Miller's perfection sat oddly with him. It was too polished, too rehearsed. It was like a risk assessment where the numbers balanced too perfectly, suggesting that the data had been manipulated. It wasn't until mid-November that Arthur took his first photograph of Thomas Miller. It was a Tuesday, a day Arthur had stayed home from work with a mild head cold. He was sitting in his front bay window, sipping tea and watching the rain strip the last of the autumn leaves from the trees. At 10:42 a.m., a blue sedan pulled up to the curb 3 houses down. It wasn't Miller's car. Miller drove a silver Mercedes. This was a nondescript Chevrolet, the kind of fleet car used by rental agencies. Arthur watched as Miller emerged from his house. He wasn't wearing the expensive suits he usually wore to work. He was dressed in gray coveralls and a utility cap, carrying a heavy tool belt. If Arthur hadn't known him, he would have mistaken him for a telephone repairman. Miller walked to the blue sedan. The driver, a woman Arthur didn't recognize, did not get out. She simply rolled down the passenger window. Miller leaned in. They spoke for less than 10 seconds. Then, Miller reached into his tool belt and handed her something small, a package wrapped in newspaper. The woman handed him a thick white envelope. The exchange was smooth, practiced. It had the choreography of a transaction that had been performed 100 times before. Arthur had the Eagle Eye 110 on the windowsill. Almost instinctively, he picked it up. The distance was considerable, perhaps 50 yards, and the rain was creating a haze. But Arthur had been practicing. He braced his elbows on the sill, held his breath, and pressed the silent shutter. Click. He wound the film. Click. He took 3 frames in rapid succession. The blue sedan drove away. Miller stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up and down the street. He scanned the windows of the neighboring houses. Arthur instinctively pulled back behind the curtain, his heart doing a strange little flutter in his chest. When Miller turned and walked back into his house, his gait had changed. He was no longer the jovial host of the block party. He moved with a sharp, predatory efficiency. Arthur went back to his tea, but the comfort of the morning was gone. He told himself he was being ridiculous. It was probably just a payment for a contractor. Maybe Miller was having work done on the house and was paying under the table to avoid taxes. That was common enough. It wasn't a crime, or at least not the kind of crime that concerned an insurance actuary. But the image of the gray coveralls stuck with him. Why would an international logistics consultant dress like a repairman to hand over a package on a Tuesday morning? Arthur developed the film that evening. The smell of the fixer chemical was sharp in the small bathroom. He watched the images appear on the paper in the red glow of the safety light. The first 2 were blurry, the rain obscuring the details. But the third frame was different. The camera, for all its cheap plastic casing, had a lens that lived up to the advertisement. The focus had caught Miller's face just as he turned away from the car. The expression was not one Arthur had ever seen on his neighbor. It was cold, hard. The smile was gone. The eyes were narrowed. But it was the detail in the car window that made Arthur freeze. In the reflection of the Chevrolet's side mirror, captured by the lucky angle of the shot, was the driver. Her face was partially obscured by sunglasses, but the camera had caught her hand resting on the door frame. She was wearing a distinctive ring, a heavy gold signet ring with a dark stone, and in the back seat of the car, visible through the rain-streaked glass, was a diplomatic pouch. It bore the vague outline of a crest. Arthur couldn't read it, but he knew what diplomatic pouches looked like. He processed insurance claims for embassies occasionally. They were distinctive. Arthur clipped the photo to the drying line and stared at it. A man in a disguise, a cash exchange, a diplomatic vehicle, in Falls Church. For the first time in his life, Arthur Pence realized that his actuarial tables could not predict what would happen next. The next day, Arthur did something he had never done in 20 years of employment. He called in sick when he wasn't sick. He didn't stay home. He drove his beige Ford into the city, but not to his office. He went to the main branch of the public library. Arthur needed data. He needed to understand what he was looking at. He spent 6 hours in the microfiche room, scrolling through back issues of newspapers. He wasn't sure what he was looking for until he found a reference in a Washington Post article from 1976 regarding the invisible front of the Cold War. The article described the expulsion of several Soviet attachés for espionage activities. It mentioned the types of cover often used by deep cover illegals, business consultants, academics, technical experts. Then he moved to the reference section. He pulled books on heraldry and government insignias. He was trying to identify the crest he had seen on the diplomatic pouch. It was grainy in the photo, just a shape really, a shield with what looked like a bird or a double-headed eagle. It took him 3 hours, but he found a match that was close enough to cause a cold sweat to break out under his wool cardigan. It wasn't Soviet, it was Hungarian. The People's Republic of Hungary, a Warsaw Pact nation with an intelligence service that often acted as a proxy for the KGB. Arthur sat at the wooden library table, surrounded by the hushed whispers of students and researchers. He felt a profound sense of dislocation. He was Arthur Pence. He worried about deductibles and flood zones. He did not worry about Warsaw Pact intelligence operations. He should go to the police. That was the logical step. But what did he have? A grainy photo of a neighbor handing a package to a car. The police would laugh. They would tell him to stop reading spy novels. They would look at his cheap mail-order camera and dismiss him as a crank. He needed more proof. Over the next 2 weeks, Arthur Pence transformed. Outwardly, he remained the same. He went to work. He ate his turkey sandwiches. But internally, he had become a hunter. He ordered a second item from the catalog, a sound amplifier dish that claimed to let you hear a whisper from across a football field. It was, unlike the camera, absolute garbage. All it picked up was the static of wind and the hum of the power lines. Arthur threw it away in frustration. He had to rely on the camera. He began to map Miller's routine. He noted that Miller left the house at odd hours, 11 p.m. on a Thursday, 4 a.m. on a Sunday. Arthur slept in his clothes, sitting in a chair by the window, the camera in his lap. He captured Miller changing license plates on the Mercedes inside his garage. The door had been left open just a foot, but Arthur lay on his stomach in his own driveway, photographing upwards through the gap in the hedge. He captured Miller burning documents in a metal drum in the backyard. The flames illuminated Miller's face, casting long, dancing shadows that made him look demonic. But the most damning piece of evidence came on December 3rd. Arthur had followed Miller. It was a reckless decision, one that violated every rule of self-preservation. Miller had driven to a shopping center in Tyson's Corner. Arthur followed at a safe distance, his heart hammering against his ribs. Miller entered a department store. He went to the men's clothing section. He didn't look at the clothes. He walked to a rack of raincoats, reached into the pocket of a beige trench coat, and pulled out a folded newspaper. He then placed a different folded newspaper into the same pocket and walked away. It was a brush pass. Arthur had read the term in the library, a classic method of exchanging information without making contact. Arthur waited until Miller had left the store. Then, with trembling hands, he walked to the rack of raincoats. He found the trench coat. He reached into the pocket. His hand closed around the newspaper. It was a copy of the Financial Times. He wanted to take it. He wanted to run with it. But he knew that if he took it, the person coming to retrieve it would know the drop had been compromised. Instead, he opened the paper right there in the aisle. Inside the fold, taped to the newsprint, was a series of numbers written on a sticky note. It looked like a phone number, but the digits were grouped strangely. 4, 8, 12, 16. Arthur pulled out the Eagle Eye 110. He held the newspaper up, pretending to read it, and snapped a photo of the numbers. He snapped a second one for safety. Then he put the paper back in the pocket, exactly as he had found it, and walked out of the store on legs that felt like jelly. By mid-December, Arthur had a dossier. It wasn't professional. It was a collection of 4x6 glossy prints kept in a shoebox under his bed. But it told a story. The license plates, the burning documents, the brush pass, the disguise. He decided it was time to go to the FBI. He took a personal day. He dressed in his best suit, a navy blue that he usually reserved for funerals. He drove to the J. Edgar Hoover building in downtown D.C. The reception area was intimidating. Uniformed guards, metal detectors. Arthur felt small. He felt like a man who had stepped off the sidewalk and fallen into a rushing river. He asked to speak to an agent. The receptionist, a woman who looked as if she had heard every crazy story in the capital, looked him over skeptically. "Regarding what subject, sir?" she asked. "Espionage," Arthur said. The word tasted strange in his mouth. "I believe my neighbor is a Soviet spy." She didn't laugh. That would have been easier. Instead, she gave him a look of weary patience. She handed him a form. "Fill this out. If an agent is available, they'll come down." Arthur filled out the form. He sat on a hard wooden bench for 2 hours. Finally, a man in a gray suit approached him. He introduced himself as Special Agent Reynolds. He looked young. Too young. "Mr. Pence?" Reynolds said, glancing at the form. "You have information about a neighbor?" Arthur nodded. He opened his briefcase and took out the shoebox. He started to lay out the photos. "His name is Thomas Miller, or that's what he says. He's using false plates. He's communicating with the Hungarian embassy. I saw a dead drop in Tyson's Corner." Reynolds looked at the photos. He picked up the one of the license plate change. "It's a bit blurry, Mr. Pence." "It was taken from 60 feet away through a hedge," Arthur said defensively. "But look at the numbers. And here, the brush pass." Reynolds flipped through the stack. He didn't look impressed. He looked like a man who was thinking about his lunch break. "Mr. Pence," Reynolds said, stacking the photos back together. "We get a lot of reports like this. People see things. They misinterpret them. Changing a license plate isn't a crime. People have personalized plates. They switch them out. Burning trash? Maybe a violation of county ordinance, but not treason. But the brush pass?" Arthur insisted. "The numbers. Did you keep the newspaper?" "No. I left it. I didn't want to disrupt the operation." Reynolds sighed. "So you have a picture of a sticky note with numbers. It could be a lottery pick. It could be a price tag. It's spycraft," Arthur said, his voice rising slightly. "Mr. Pence," Reynolds said, his tone firming up, "we appreciate your vigilance, truly, but the Bureau requires concrete evidence to open an investigation on a U.S. citizen. Surveillance without a warrant is a sticky area. My advice? Go home. Let Mr. Miller live his life. If you see him building a missile in his backyard, give us a call." Reynolds stood up. The meeting was over. Arthur packed his photos back into the shoebox. He felt a flush of humiliation rising up his neck. He walked out of the building, the heavy glass doors closing behind him with a sound of finality. They didn't believe him. They thought he was just another lonely, paranoid suburbanite with too much time on his hands. But Arthur knew what he had seen. He knew the look in Miller's eyes in the rain. He knew the precision of that handoff. He drove home in silence. When he turned onto Elm Street, he saw Miller's silver Mercedes in the driveway. Miller was out front, washing the car. He looked up as Arthur drove past. He waved. A big, friendly, neighborly wave. Arthur didn't wave back. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles were white. If the FBI wouldn't stop him, Arthur thought, then who would? He looked at the passenger seat where the shoebox sat. He was alone. Just him and his mail order camera. Christmas came and went. The neighborhood was draped in lights. Thomas Miller had the best display on the block, a life-sized Santa and 8 reindeer on the roof. It was ostentatious. It was perfect camouflage. Who would suspect the man with the glowing Rudolph of being an enemy of the state? Arthur spent his holidays in the dark room. He was reviewing the negatives again, looking for something he had missed, something Reynolds had missed. He magnified the images using a magnifying glass he had taped to a desk lamp. He focused on the photo of the brush pass again, the sticky note. 481216. It wasn't a phone number. It was a sequence. Multiples of 4. Or coordinates? No. Times? Arthur went back to his logbook. He had been writing down everything. He looked at the dates of the strange occurrences. The license plate change, October 4th. The burning documents, October 8th. The repairman disguise, November 12th. The brush pass, December 16th. The dates matched the numbers. The sticky note wasn't a message to be received. It was a schedule of drops. Arthur's heart raced. If the pattern held, the next event would be on the 20th, January 20th, or maybe December 20th. No, the pattern was the day of the month. He looked at the calendar. Today was January 14th. The 20th was 6 days away. He had 6 days to prepare. He had 6 days to catch Thomas Miller in an act so undeniable that even Special Agent Reynolds would have to listen. But he also noticed something else. In the background of one of the photos taken of Miller's house, there was a window on the second floor. The curtains were usually drawn. But in this photo, there was a gap. Arthur held the magnifying glass closer. Inside the room, sitting on a desk, was a radio. Not a normal radio. It was large, with multiple dials and a large antenna. It looked like a shortwave transmitter, and next to it was a photograph in a frame. Arthur squinted. The grain was terrible. He couldn't make out the face, but he could make out the uniform. It was a military uniform. And the hat. The hat was peaked in the distinctive Soviet style. Miller had gotten sloppy. He had left a piece of his real life exposed for a fraction of a second, and the Eagle Eye 110 had caught it. Arthur realized he couldn't just take pictures from the street anymore. He needed to get closer. He needed to get inside the house. The opportunity arrived 3 days later. Miller knocked on Arthur's door. Arthur froze when he heard the knock. He hid the shoebox under the sofa cushions and went to the door. Miller was standing there, holding a package. "Arthur," Miller beamed. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." "No," Arthur managed to say. "Not at all. Listen, the postman dropped this at my place by mistake. It's addressed to you." He held out a small box. It was a refill order of film Arthur had sent for. "Oh," Arthur said, taking it. "Thank you." "You're a photographer?" Miller asked, nodding at the return address on the box. "I didn't know that." "Just a hobby," Arthur said. "Birds, nature. Fascinating," Miller said. His eyes scanned the room behind Arthur. It was a casual glance, but Arthur felt it like a physical touch. Miller was assessing. "You know, I have some old camera equipment from my father. Lenses, tripods. I've been meaning to clear it out of the attic. You should come by and take a look. Take it off my hands." It was a trap, or it was a genuine offer, or it was a test. "That's very kind," Arthur said. "Come by Saturday," Miller said. "Around noon, I'll make coffee." "Saturday," Arthur repeated. "Yes, I'll be there." Miller smiled again, but this time the smile didn't reach his eyes. "See you then, Arthur." He turned and walked back down the path. Arthur watched him go. Saturday was the 20th, the date from the sequence. Miller was inviting him into the lion's den on the very day an operation was scheduled to take place. Arthur closed the door and locked it. He leaned his back against the wood, breathing hard. He wasn't a spy. He was an actuary, but on Saturday he was going to have to be an actor. He went to the kitchen and opened the new box of film. He loaded the Eagle Eye 110. He checked the mechanism. Then, he did something he had never done. He took the telephone off the hook. He didn't want anyone to call. He didn't want to be distracted. He had a date with the KGB's most wanted man, and all he had was a plastic camera and a beige cardigan to protect him. Saturday, January 20th, arrived under a blanket of low, gray steel clouds that threatened snow but delivered only a biting wind. Arthur Pence woke at 5 a.m., though he had not truly slept. He spent the early morning hours drinking black coffee and rehearsing his lines in the mirror. He had to be Arthur Pence, the boring insurance actuary. He had to be the man who cared about deductibles and bird migrations, not the man who knew about brush passes and diplomatic pouches. He dressed carefully, the beige cardigan again, his armor of mediocrity. Underneath, tucked into the waistband of his trousers and obscured by the wool, was the Eagle Eye 110. It was a risk. If Miller patted him on the back or if the camera slipped, it would be over. But Arthur felt naked without it. At 11:55 a.m., he walked down the sidewalk toward number 442. The wind bit at his exposed face. He noticed Miller's car was parked in the driveway, positioned nose out, ready for a quick departure. A subtle tactical choice that most neighbors would miss, but Arthur filed it away. He rang the doorbell at exactly 12 p.m. Punctuality was part of his persona. The door swung open immediately. Thomas Miller stood there, wearing a thick cable-knit sweater and holding a mug of steaming coffee. He looked the picture of suburban relaxation, yet his eyes swept the street behind Arthur before settling on his guest. "Arthur, right on time," Miller boomed, stepping back to allow him entry. Come in. Get out of the cold." The house smelled of expensive cologne and stale tobacco, masked by the scent of brewing coffee. The interior was sparsely furnished, almost staging-like. There were no personal clutter, no piles of mail, no stray shoes. It was a house that could be abandoned in 10 minutes without leaving a trace. "I have the equipment in the study," Miller said, leading him down the hallway. "My father was an enthusiast like you, though I fear he lacked the talent." They entered a room at the back of the house. It was lined with bookshelves filled with encyclopedias and technical manuals. In the center was a heavy oak desk. On the desk sat a cardboard box. "Help yourself," Miller said, gesturing to the box. "I'll get you some coffee. Black, right?" "Yes, thank you," Arthur said, his voice sounding thin to his own ears. As soon as Miller left the room, Arthur moved. He didn't look at the box. He knew what was in it. Junk. Old lenses, broken bodies, things to distract him. Instead, he scanned the room. His eyes landed on the desk. It was clean, disturbingly so. But next to the telephone was a notepad. The top sheet had been torn off, but the impression of the writing remained on the page underneath. Arthur pulled the Eagle Eye 110 from his waistband. He held it at a low angle, trying to catch the light on the indented paper. Click. He wound the film silently. Click. He heard footsteps in the hall. He shoved the camera back into his pants and turned to the bookshelf, pulling out a volume of Encyclopedia Britannica. Miller entered, carrying 2 mugs. He paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes flicking to Arthur, then to the desk, then back. "Finding anything interesting?" Miller asked, his voice smooth but with a new, harder edge. "Just admiring your collection," Arthur said, holding up the book. 1968 edition, very comprehensive. Miller set the coffee down. He walked over to Arthur, standing just a little too close. "So, Arthur, tell me about these birds you photograph. What kind of lenses do you use? Telephoto? Wide angle?" It was a test. Miller knew photography. If Arthur stumbled, he would know he was lying. "I don't use professional gear," Arthur stammered, channeling his genuine social anxiety. "I just use a simple point and shoot. I like the challenge of getting close. Patience, waiting for the blue jay to land on the feeder." Miller stared at him. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then Miller laughed. A loud barking sound. "Patience," Miller said, clapping a hand on Arthur's shoulder. Arthur flinched, terrified the man would feel the hard plastic of the camera. "That is a virtue, Arthur, a dangerous one." Miller walked back to the desk. He picked up the notepad Arthur had just photographed. He tore off the top sheet, crumbled it into a ball and dropped it into his pocket. "You know, Arthur, Miller said, leaning against the desk. "I've been watching you too." Arthur's blood ran cold. "Watching me? You're very precise. You leave at 7:45. You return at 5:15. You mow your lawn on Saturdays at 9. A man of routine. I like that. It makes you trustworthy." "I suppose so," Arthur whispered. "Take the camera equipment," Miller said suddenly, his tone dismissing. "Take the whole box. I have work to do." Arthur grabbed the box. It was heavy. "Thank you, Thomas. This is very generous." "Just doing my part for the neighborhood," Miller said. He didn't walk Arthur to the door. Arthur let himself out. He walked down the driveway, the box digging into his arms. He didn't run, though every instinct screamed at him to sprint. He walked at his normal, measured pace. When he got inside his own house, he locked the door, slid the deadbolt, and collapsed onto the floor. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the box. He had survived, but he knew, with absolute certainty, that Thomas Miller knew something was wrong. The way Miller had removed that page, he suspected. Arthur ran to the bathroom. He had to develop that photo. The impression on the notepad was the key. The developing process felt agonizingly slow. Arthur worked in the red gloom of his makeshift darkroom, the chemicals stinging his nose. He agitated the tray, watching the gray soup swirl over the paper. Slowly, the image emerged. It was low contrast, a nightmare of shadows and light. But the Eagle Eye 110 had done its job. The macro focus, combined with the raking light from the window, had captured the indentations left by the pen. Arthur used a magnifying glass and a pencil to trace the ghostwriting on a separate piece of paper. It wasn't English. It wasn't text. It was a series of coordinates and a frequency. 3889N, 7705W, 14 tone 220 MHz, 2200. Arthur recognized the coordinates immediately. He had spent enough time looking at maps of the DC area for his insurance adjustments. 3889, N, 77.05W, the Lincoln Memorial, and 2200. 10 o'clock at night, tonight, the 20th. The frequency, 14. 220 MHz was a standard amateur radio band, often used for long-distance communication. But in the context of Miller's house, it likely meant a burst transmission. Arthur sat back on his heels. The 20th wasn't just a dead drop. It was a meeting, or a signal. A brush pass might be too risky now that Miller was spooked. A meeting at a public landmark at night. That was bold. Arthur looked at his watch. It was 4 p.m. He had 6 hours. He thought about calling Agent Reynolds again. He reached for the phone, but he stopped. What did he have? A photo of a blank piece of paper with indentations that he had interpreted. Reynolds would say he was hallucinating. Reynolds would say he was harassing a citizen. No, Reynolds needed to see it happen. Arthur formulated a plan that was so reckless it made his stomach turn. He wasn't going to call the FBI to report a suspicion. He was going to call the FBI to report a crime in progress. But first, he had to be there. He spent the next few hours preparing. He put fresh batteries in his flashlight. He loaded his last roll of high-speed film into the Eagle Eye. He dressed in dark clothing, not his beige cardigan, but a navy turtleneck and a black windbreaker he hadn't worn in years. He waited by the window. At 9:15 p.m., the garage door at 442 Elm opened. The silver Mercedes backed out. Arthur didn't take his car. His car was known. He grabbed his bicycle from the shed, a rusty Schwinn he hadn't ridden since the oil crisis. He wheeled it down the back alley, mounting it only when he was 2 streets away. It was a 7-mile ride to the National Mall. In the freezing January wind, it was a torture test. Arthur pedaled through the darkness, his breath tearing at his throat. He was 52 years old. He was an actuary. He was not built for this. But as he pedaled, a strange clarity settled over him. For years he had assessed risk for others. He had calculated the probability of fires, floods, and thefts. He had lived his life trying to avoid all of them. Now he was cycling directly into the center of a catastrophe, and he had never felt more alive. Arthur arrived at the Lincoln Memorial at 9:50 p.m. He locked his bike near the concession stand, which was shuttered for the winter. The area was largely deserted, save for a few tourists braving the cold to gaze up at the seated giant. He moved into the shadows of the trees lining the reflecting pool. The water was a sheet of black ice. At 9:58 p.m. he saw him. Thomas Miller, or whatever his real name was walking up the steps of the memorial. He was wearing the beige trench coat Arthur had seen at the department store. He carried a folded newspaper. Miller didn't look at the statue. He walked to the far left side, between the massive columns, and leaned against the marble, looking out toward the Washington Monument. Arthur crept closer. He moved from tree trunk to tree trunk, his heart hammering so loud he feared it would echo across the mall. He got within 50 yards. It wasn't close enough for a photo in this darkness. Then, a second figure appeared. He came from the back of the monument, emerging from the darkness like a wraith. He was shorter than Miller, wearing a dark overcoat and a fedora. He walked with a cane, but he moved quickly. The two men didn't shake hands. They stood side by side, looking out at the city. Arthur raised the eagle eye. The lighting was terrible. The flash would give him away instantly. He had to trust the ambient light from the monument's floodlights. He braced the camera against the rough bark of an elm tree. Click. The wind carried their voices away, but Arthur saw the exchange. The short man handed Miller a small, thick envelope. Miller handed the short man a metal canister. Film. This was it. The handover. But then, something went wrong. The short man turned to leave, but he stopped. He looked toward the tree line, toward Arthur. Arthur froze. Had he snapped a twig? Had the reflection of the lens caught the light? The short man said something to Miller. Miller turned. Both men were now staring directly into the darkness where Arthur stood. Miller reached into his coat. He didn't pull out a newspaper. He pulled out a gun. A silenced pistol, long and sleek. Arthur didn't think. He didn't calculate. He ran. He scrambled back from the tree, his boots slipping on the frozen grass. "Hey!" Miller's voice was a bark of command. "Stop." A thwip sound cut through the air, followed by the crack of bark exploding next to Arthur's head. Arthur scrambled onto the pavement. He sprinted toward the kiosk where a payphone stood illuminated in a pool of yellow light. It was his only chance. He heard running footsteps behind him. Miller was fast, much faster than Arthur. Arthur reached the phone booth. He fumbled for a quarter. He didn't have one. He dropped his keys. Panic seized him, a cold, choking grip. He didn't dial 911. He dialed the operator. "Police!" he screamed. "Federal agent in trouble. Lincoln Memorial. Officer down." It was a lie. A desperate, calculated lie to get the fastest response time possible. He slammed the receiver down and turned. Miller was 20 feet away, the gun raised. His face was a mask of pure, cold fury. "You little pest," Miller hissed. "I should have gutted you in your living room." Arthur held up the camera. It was a pathetic shield. "I have the pictures," Arthur gasped. "I have everything. The codes, the maps, the Hungarian crest." Miller hesitated, just for a second. "Give me the camera, Arthur, and maybe you live." "No," Arthur said, and he meant it. Miller took a step forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. Suddenly, high beams flooded the area. Tires screeched on the asphalt. A parked police cruiser jumped the curb, its siren wailing. Miller spun around, hiding the gun inside his coat in a single fluid motion. He looked at the cruiser, then back at Arthur. He made a calculation. He turned and ran, sprinting into the darkness of the construction area near the Korean War Veterans Memorial Site. The police car skidded to a halt. An officer jumped out, gun drawn. "Drop it!" he yelled at Arthur. Arthur dropped the camera. It hit the pavement with a plastic clatter. "He went that way," Arthur screamed, pointing. "He's a spy! He has a gun!" Arthur was not thanked. He was arrested. He was handcuffed, shoved into the back of the cruiser, and driven to the D.C. Central lockup. He spent 4 hours in a holding cell surrounded by drunks and pickpockets. He sat on the bench, shivering, still wearing his windbreaker. At 3:00 a.m., the door opened. It wasn't a police officer. It was Special Agent Reynolds. Reynolds looked tired. He was wearing a wrinkled shirt and holding a styrofoam cup of coffee. He motioned for the guard to unlock the cell. "Come with me, Mr. Pence." Reynolds said quietly. They went to a small interrogation room. Reynolds sat down and placed a plastic bag on the table. Inside was the Eagle Eye 110. You caused quite a stir, Reynolds said, calling in an officer down. That's a felony. Did you catch him? Arthur asked. Reynolds ignored the question. We developed your film, Arthur. The lab guys laughed at the camera, said it was a toy. Arthur stared at the table. Then they looked at the negatives. Reynolds continued. He pulled a file folder from his briefcase. He opened it. There, blown up to 8x10 size, grainy but unmistakable, was the image of the notepad, the indentations, the coordinates, and the picture from the memorial. It was dark, yes, but the silhouette of the short man. Reynolds tapped the photo of the short man. Do you know who this is? No, Arthur said. That is Viktor Leshkov, second secretary of the Soviet embassy, known KGB resident. Reynolds looked up, his eyes meeting Arthur's. We've been trying to tie him to a handler for 3 years. We knew there was a leak in the Defense Department. We called him the engineer. We never had a face. We never had a connection. Reynolds slid the photo of Miller across the table. Thomas Miller isn't Thomas Miller, Reynolds said. His real name is Conrad Harlan. He's a logistics planner for the Pentagon. He has top secret clearance for NATO supply lines. Arthur let out a breath he felt he had been holding for months. He ran into the woods. We know, Reynolds said. He got away. He's in the wind. So I failed, Arthur said bitterly. No, Reynolds said. He leaned forward. You didn't fail. You panicked him. A spy who runs is a spy who makes mistakes. He's not following his exfiltration plan. He's improvising. And thanks to your little toy camera, we know what car he's driving. We know his alias. And we know he's desperate. Reynolds stood up. We're going to 442 Elm Street. We're tearing that house apart. And you're coming with us. Why? Arthur asked. Because, Reynolds said, a small smile touching his lips. You noticed the floorboard in the study. I want to know what else you noticed. The raid on 442 Elm Street was silent and professional. No sirens, just a team of men in windbreakers moving with surgical precision. Arthur stood in the living room with Reynolds. The house felt different now, abandoned, dead. The study, Arthur said. He crumbled a paper and put it in his pocket. But he looked at the globe. When I picked up the encyclopedia, he glanced at the globe. Reynolds motioned to a technician. Check the globe. The technician examined the antique globe on the stand. He found a seam along the equator. He twisted it. The globe popped open. Inside were passports, 5 of them, cash, and a set of car keys for a vehicle Arthur had never seen. A contingency car, Reynolds said, stashed somewhere nearby. He mentioned Tyson's Corner, Arthur said. The department store, the brush pass. Reynolds grabbed his radio. All units check long-term parking structures near Tyson's Corner Center. Look for a vehicle matching the keys found. Looks like a Ford Bronco. Arthur walked through the house as the agents worked. He felt a strange sense of violation. This was where he had drunk coffee just hours ago. This was where a man who mowed his lawn on Sundays had planned the betrayal of his country. At 6 a.m., a call came over the radio. Unit 4, we found the Bronco. Tyson's 2 parking deck. Engine is cold, but we have a movement on a credit card. A gas station in Maryland, heading north on I-95. He's running for the Canadian border, Reynolds said. He's burned his bridges. He's going for a dash. Reynolds looked at Arthur. Go home, Arthur. Get some sleep. We'll take it from here. I want to know, Arthur said. I want to know if you get him. You'll see it on the news, Reynolds said. Or maybe you won't. That's how this works. Arthur walked back to his house. The sun was coming up. The street looked exactly the same as it always did. The milkman was delivering bottles to the house across the street. Arthur went inside. He didn't sleep. He sat in his chair by the window, watching the empty house at the end of the cul-de-sac. 2 days later, the news broke. It wasn't a headline about spies. It was a small story in the Metro section. Government employee arrested after high-speed chase in Maine. Conrad Harlan, alias Thomas Miller, had been caught 10 miles from the New Brunswick border. He had crashed his car into a snowbank while trying to evade a state trooper. Arthur read the article while eating his turkey sandwich. It mentioned that the FBI had been acting on an anonymous tip. There was no mention of the Eagle Eye 110, no mention of the actuary and the beige cardigan. 3 months later, spring had returned to Falls Church. The for sale sign was back up at 442 Elm Street. The real estate agent described it as a charming colonial with a finished basement. Arthur Pence was back at work. He was processing a claim for a warehouse fire in Baltimore. His life had returned to its perfect equilibrium. The numbers balanced. The risks were calculated. One afternoon, a package arrived at his desk at the insurance firm. It had no return address. Arthur opened it. Inside was a new camera, a real one, a Nikon FM2 with a 50mm lens. Expensive, professional. There was no note, just a single photograph included in the box. It was a picture of Arthur. It had been taken from a distance, likely from a car. It showed Arthur riding his bicycle, his face set in grim determination, pedaling toward the Lincoln Memorial on that freezing night in January. Arthur turned the photo over. On the back, in handwriting he recognized as Agent Reynolds's, were 3 words. "Nice shot, Ansel." Arthur smiled. He put the Nikon on his shelf, next to his stapler. He never used it. He went home that evening. He opened his junk drawer. There, nestled among the rubber bands and paper clips, was the Eagle Eye 110. The plastic was scratched. The lens was dusty. He picked it up. He looked through the viewfinder one last time. He saw his kitchen. He saw his backyard. He saw a world that looked ordinary, boring, and safe. But Arthur knew better now. He knew that the world was a veneer, a thin layer of paint over a rotting structure of secrets. He knew that monsters lived in split-level houses and drove silver Mercedes. And he knew that sometimes, all it took to catch a monster was a man who paid attention and a 1995 piece of plastic. Arthur put the camera back in the drawer and closed it. He walked to the window and looked out at the street. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawns. "Subscribe for more stories from the archives," he whispered to the empty room, a little joke just for himself. Then he turned off the light and went to bed. The neighborhood was quiet. For now.